welcome back. We're now hearing from Rachel Donald, who runs Planet Critical, which is a podcast and a newsletter for a world in crisis. There's over 11,000 subscribers in over 160 countries. And it's really the best interview-based podcast out there in sustainability. It interviews Naomi Oreskes, George Monbiot, ex-BP bosses. Really take a look if you don't know it. He's also an acclaimed climate corruption journalist with pieces in The Guardian, The Intercept, Mongo Bay, and so on. So we're very lucky to have you, Rachel. Please take it away.
Thank you very much, Fabian. I'm really delighted to be here. And for everyone listening, everyone in the room, I also interviewed Fabian. So that's maybe the first interview that you can go and check out if you're interested. So hi, that was a really lovely introduction. I feel very sort of honored by it. Fabian has asked me to kind of start with like how I got into the work that I do. And the answer that I always give is that I ran out of other ideas. I think that there is a really big sort of propensity in our culture to create hero narratives. And I think it's also really important to deconstruct these because we are not individual heroes. None of us are independent. Part of being an ecosystem of journalism or an ecosystem of activism or an ecosystem of people, quite frankly, who are just trying to tackle the global crises that we face means highlighting that ecosystem as much as possible. So I started Planet Critical before it was really Planet Critical, and I didn't really know what I was doing. I just wanted an excuse to speak to interesting people. It was COVID. I didn't really have much else on. And so I just launched a podcast, and it began as a podcast for people who were pissed off with capitalism. And the one good idea I had when launching it was that every guest would platform somebody else at the end of every episode. And so it grew quite quickly. I got access to people very, very quickly because as long as they had a good time being interviewed by me, they would happily introduce me via email to somebody. And so I essentially climbed the ranks relatively quickly. Planet Critical's only sort of been going for 3 years, less so in its current form. But I have interviewed everybody from, ex-head of BP, journalists, politicians around the world, activists around the world, artists around the world, thanks to this kind of platforming technique. So while I was doing that, I interviewed a woman called Claire Rucastle-Brown, who is the creator of Sarawak Report, which is one of the only independent sort of news outlets in operating in Malaysia. And she is single-handedly exposed the largest financial corruption scandal the world has ever seen. It's called 1MDB, where the former president of Malaysia, former prime minister of Malaysia, and his cronies managed to ransack billions of dollars from the Malaysian economy. It was linked to the illegal logging in Sarawak and Borneo, which is the oldest rainforest in the world, unfortunately, which has been 80% of which has been devastated now by logging. The money that was stolen from the Malaysian people and from their natural resources essentially found its way everywhere. It got into Hollywood. It was that money that funded the Wolf of Wall Street. It bought this tiny, fat little Malaysian businessman dates with people like Paris Hilton and Miranda Kerr. And it saw the United States Department of Justice attempt to repatriate a huge amount of that money after the scandal was exposed by this woman with a blog. Now, when I was interviewing her, she gave this tip off about Leonardo DiCaprio and how he'd never had to repatriate the money that he had been given by these sort of corrupt businessmen. And so I went away and I investigated the story, and I spent a couple of days poring over Department of Justice documents. Now, remember, as I said, I really had very little to do at the time. And I managed to piece together a story enough to ask questions. Why was it that Leonardo DiCaprio's name disappears from the Department of Justice documents from one year to another? Why was it that he was still cavorting with a Malaysian businessman who was on the run and is still on the run long after that businessman had been exposed by the press for his corrupt dealings, the theft of billions of dollars, and after a lot of the other members of the crew had been put in prison? So I wrote up this piece and I published it on my little site at the time. And I sent it to her and I said, thank you very much for the tip off. I just thought that you'd quite like to see this. And she called me back and she said, did you do this? And I said, yeah. And she goes, right, I'll call you back. And she called me back a week later. And she said, I'm very busy and I need somebody to research a story. Can you do it for me? And we had that kind of relationship where she would call me up every once in a while and she would need research or somebody to write it. And eventually she made me producer of Radio Free Sarawak, which is the only independent radio station in Malaysia, which produces Indigenous news for Indigenous people by Indigenous people. And what I mean by that is tracking the links between industry and government and the corruption, the crony corruption that is driving the deforestation in Malaysia. So I did that, and essentially it was my first look into systems and complexity, I suppose, in a sense. Systems isn't something that's really spoken about a lot outside of, I think, this particular area of study, you know, what's going on in the world and why is it like this. But I got to see firsthand, essentially, the political corruption that was driving the rampant growth of industry that was decimating the forest, which was impacting and killing the indigenous peoples, and also having a local impact on the climate, more flooding, more devastation from flooding, less resilience to climatic shocks, and then also how the international community was ignoring that because they need the resources that come from Malaysia. So that was how I learned this world, essentially, through a very practical lens before I sort of put the theory on it. At the same time, I was still developing this podcast, and eventually I interviewed Steve Keen on the economics of climate change. And he essentially gave me the theory as to this practical, the explanation as to this thing that I was seeing as producer of this show. And so I rebranded as a climate corruption journalist myself. I'm the first one in the world because I made it up. Whatever, take it, have it, do it. And also Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. Now, I chose climate corruption as opposed to corruption because I wanted to work on stuff that was related to the climate crisis, but I didn't want to do the kind of journalism that everybody else was doing, like chasing after big oil and all this kind of stuff, because we know who the bad guys are. There's a huge amount of resources being thrown at those problems, and there's a lot of journalists who are deeply, deeply talented who are working on that. I wanted to do something slightly different. I wanted to look at the corruption that was driving the climate crisis, i.e. the greenwashing, the things that we think are okay but are not okay, the solutions that hide the fact that this is a systemic issue, that we cannot just substitute one thing in for another. So, for example, one of the things I did was look at Drax, which is the largest renewable energy supplier in the United Kingdom, that is also the single biggest emitter of carbon emissions in the United Kingdom. But because their carbon emissions are classified, because they're classified as renewable energy, their carbon emissions aren't taken into the nation's carbon budget, essentially. So our single biggest source of emissions isn't being balanced on the books. And so I wrote about that. Another thing, my first sort of big world exclusive was my investigation into the fashion industry and how fashion stakeholders had sort of colluded to set up a series of organizations and for-profit initiatives that were managing the sustainability standards of the industry. And I managed to break the story in The Intercept just a week before it was going to get passed into law in New York, that this metric for measuring sustainability, which had been written by the very people who are seeking to protect the bottom line, and which had very corruptly established polyester as the most sustainable fiber that there is because it's actually the cheapest. And I found the direct links as well to oil companies that were sort of funding this initiative. Thanks to that, it kind of stopped being put into law in New York, and the organization behind it got disbanded. But I was just very interested in it and how it was that sustainability had been handed over to the very industries, the very stakeholders that are causing the problem. And this is something that we see everywhere at the moment. Rather than governments coming together and taking really tough but important decisions on the kinds of system reform that we need to see, we see them handing over the problem to the markets and expecting market-based solutions to solve an issue which is fundamentally caused in part by the market. And that's why we're seeing no progress. So the more that I did the podcast and the more that I did these investigations, the more I became, I guess, you could say, like an expert in these like big picture stuff, these big picture topics. And funnily enough, the harder I then found it to be a freelance journalist, because people didn't want to take my stories that were about connecting these dots from all over the world and news that had necessary analysis in it in order to kind of make sense of the thing that I was trying to elucidate. And I think that brings me on quite nicely to the fact that in the climate space now, it really is small independent newsrooms that are leading the way. Planet Critical is just a small, node in an ecosystem of really fantastic journalism. There is Heated by Emily Atkin. She is a climate accountability journalist. She is one member who's been absolutely hammering after sort of like American politics and big oil, Exxon in the United States. And her investigations have been brought to the floor of Congress by politicians like AOC. There's the Drilled Newsroom by Amy Westervelt, which is an international team of journalists who are working to expose, so many different things. They were sort of the team that put together the links between big oil and big tobacco, how big oil was using the big tobacco playbook to promote climate denialism and stop policy going through. They're also the team that have exposed the think tanks that are funding or creating the ideas for climate policy around the world, which includes denying the fact that climate is a problem and also vilifying climate protesters. So I'm sure you've seen all over Europe and in the United States, there's a big move to criminalize protest, especially climate protest. Although in the past few weeks, it just looks like all protest. And that is directly due to the Atlas network and their big ideas. And finally, somebody I interviewed recently, Emma Gilchrist of the Narwhal, which is the only and first independent climate nonprofit newsroom set up in Canada that was working to expose these stories. And why I think it's really important to mention these other amazing women and their teams is the fact that journalism is experiencing layoffs all around the world right now. It is hemorrhaging staff, hemorrhaging resources. And at the same time, these independent newsrooms are growing in strength and growing in numbers because journalism has failed. It has fundamentally failed to hold power to account. Otherwise, the world would not be in the position that it is today. And people have lost faith in journalism and the media because they have seen that. They have seen journalism fail. They have seen media be in the pockets of politicians. They have seen the corruption and the collusion that goes on in the halls of power. And these independent newsrooms are finally researching and writing the stories that people want. People want to know more about how the world actually works. People want to know what is going on with regards to corruption and what they can do about it. And they want to know more about climate because they believe it is important, even if our leaders in charge would like to pretend that it is not as big a problem as we all know it to be. And I guess this leads me finally on to advocacy journalism. So I did a brief stint as an academic about a year ago. And I was teaching journalism at a university in London. And one of the things that we would talk about with our students was the spectrum of journalism and how journalism often gets stuck in this impartiality debate or objective debate, which is completely nonsensical and was debunked by the Academy a long time ago. But most mainstream journalists are still laboring under the impression that they can be objective. And one of the things that we talked about on the other end of the scale was advocacy journalism and this willingness now to be transparent about one's values and biases, which I think helps to reveal the complexity of the world and be more honest about the fact that when you were approaching a story, you were coming from a certain value proposition or a certain moral basis. And the fact that a lot of these independent journalism newsrooms now are operating as advocacy journalists. They recognize that there is no debate. Either we reform radically the way that the world is set up and support the people who are trying to change the world, the activists that are putting their bodies on the line, the students that are putting their bodies on the line right now in New York and all over the United States. Or we continue to crumble into increasing inequality, increasing climate disaster, mass migrations, death, food system collapse, economic collapse, all of these things. And so I think what we're seeing is at the same time that we are seeing politics really radically transform often around the world in quite a negative way, we are seeing this ecosystem of people who believe in something better transform as well in response. And dare sort of take up the mantle of saying that they have something to believe in, something worth fighting for, and are willing to model what a brave new world could look like. So I think that's enough for me. Fabian, I hope that was what you were looking for.
Thank you very much. Very good. Very good. Thank you very much.
If you're talking, I can't hear you.
And now we have enough time for questions, which is very good. Already the first one, please.
Hi, Rachel, big fan. Thank you so much. I have a question about, you said, small independent media rooms are coming up. And I've always wondered, you have really good journalists like yourself and these teams, and maybe say John Oliver exposing this kind of corruption. But is there a John Oliver effect where these things are exposed, but something actually happens? I'm not sure about, there's the exposure and that's coming out, but does the system actually change after that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's something that I have personally struggled with. And actually, it's one of the reasons why I do less and less climate corruption investigations now, because I got kind of fed up of putting this information out there and seeing nothing happen. I suppose that's a failure on my part, not to link up more directly with activist networks and find out what is it that you need exposed? Like, what is it that you're working on? What is it that you're trying to change? Maybe we could try and find a weak spot in the existing system and push that through. I think there probably does need to be more, I mean, we're all in touch with activist networks, but probably like more direct collaboration and strategy in that respect. But I think something that's important is just hammering the message home all the time. One of the reasons that not a lot gets done after investigations is because so much is being exposed everywhere that, like, the fashion thing, it kind of falls away because there's some news scandal over there that, the next day. That's the problem with the news cycle. And that's why I think it's really exciting to see heated, drilled, the Narwhal beat the same drum over and over and over again whilst this messaging gets through, because really we as journalists can give information, but it's up to the public and other organizations to get organized with that information. I do think that we should probably be more involved with the strategizing on how we do that. But it's the awareness of this is an ecosystem of action, right? Like, we do our bit, it's on other people to do their bit, and working together to ensure we essentially just keep throwing rocks at Goliath as much as we can.
Thanks.
Yeah, nice. That's also what Paul Behrens, who gave the opening keynote, says a lot. You have to repeat the message so much that you're physically ill of it. You have to be revolted by it so that then it trickles through. There was a question here in the front.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. Found it really nice. I got a question regarding how you target your audience, because I think there are a lot of people that, because of many reasons, I don't know, polarization or belief systems, that are far away from the climate. They're maybe more in the climate denial than in the climate corruption, kind of the whole thing. And how you try to also get them on board on your message that you try to share among the world.
Bad news. I don't have a strategy. I do what I enjoy. That's really it. Like, I speak to people that I want to speak to, and I don't think about my audience too much. If they want to come on the journey, they will. If they don't, they won't. I have noticed that I do tend to have a fairly broad spectrum of people. Like, your anarchists, and your hippies on the left, and then your right wingers on the. Seriously, no, I get quite a few right-wing people following my work. I have no idea why. I think it's because like Planet Critical is a vault of information. Like, yes, I skew much, much more. I'm very open about the fact that I'm on the left, and I'm very open. Like, you can hear in the way that I interview people, that's the direction that I want to drive in. But no matter the political bias or beliefs, there's such a treasure trove of information being given by my guests that I think it just attracts people from both sides. But yeah, I don't have a strategy. I'm kind of like allergic to strategy. And I find it all very quick dull, I'm afraid. I hope that's okay.
Very good. There's a question in the back.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. I was wondering, especially because of the hemorrhaging going on, how do you fund yourself, or how do other climate change-oriented networks fund themselves? And so I personally am from Germany. We have a fairly strong public media conglomerate, I would call it, that is funded through mandatory contributions. And I often now see in other topics, let's say far right, in like that there's investigative journalism that's done collectively or together with public networks, or at least gets distributed much more widely through public networks. So I'm assuming you're in the UK. maybe, I don't know actually where you're based, but have you like considered linking up with a network like BBC? Is that something that you already, okay. Never mind.
No. Okay. So again, I'm not a strategist, but people like Amy at Drilled have created deals essentially with outlets like the Guardian, where they and DSmog, where like the same story will get published in multiple papers on the same day, which is an excellent way of increasing reach. That's often what these like small newsrooms will do. I don't even know how to begin that negotiation, so I just, you know, that's not something that I do. Me and Emily, who run Seated, we are funded by our subscribers. So I'm totally independent. I have no ads, no paywalls. Everything is open source. Everything is open access. That was the deal from day one, and I made no money for like 18 months. But now it is my community that funds my work, totally, which I mean, it's so important to me to be independent and to be agile. It's one of the reasons that I personally don't want to link up with any of these old big like media beasts like the BBC or the Guardian. I also don't like working in big teams because of that desire to be agile, but also, these bastards didn't do their job properly. So why is it that they would then get, you know, to have my work like associated with my work when they failed? The Guardian failed, BBC failed, they all failed to do their job properly. So personally, I don't want to allow them to now greenwash or systems wash or revolution wash or whatever their work just by partnering with me. I want them to see people like me, Emily, Amy, and all that kind of stuff and go, ooh, that's where journalism is going. And we're going to have to do it too if we want to keep up.
Excellent. Question here?
Yeah, some other things you mentioned actually make me of questions I ask myself also. So here you created something that's really like next to these big media ecosystem and everything. But is there a little bit, like I'm always wondering whether it's best to just exit these systems that you don't like and don't seem to do what would be necessary and create something that you think can work next to it, but which is by definition quite small, or whether it's also important to like have some radical people that do stay in these big systems, because even if the BBC and the Guardian haven't done their job properly, like you're saying, they're still the ones that do get a lot of coverage and that are considered as media of reference. So for instance, having the Guardian running more and more stories about the climate crisis does have an impact, I think. So what do you think in terms of staying within these systems and trying to maybe radicalize them a little bit, or like just exiting and doing your own thing outside?
It's a good question. I think you know the answer already from everything that I have said. And so I want to preface that what I say works for me. Like whatever anyone does, they have to figure out what they want to do for them and what would be best for them. And the fact that in this like ecosystem of independent journalism, there is a diversity in our way of thinking and approach and strategy, or lack of, that is to our strength. Right? Because the last thing that we want to do is coalesce into some kind of like centralized tactic and lose essentially the diversity of our approach. But I don't think that reform is possible. Personally, I don't think that you can go into the maw of the beast and get it to change. I don't think that it is worth people's sort of time or energy to go into diseased environments and try to heal them. I think that it is much more fun and better with our energy to create the alternative and then invite people in, say, hey, you seem to be in a diseased environment, would you like to come and join us here? I think that it's more effective, I think that it's more visionary, and I think that it's actually a better overall strategy, because at the end of the day, when you've got things like, you know, papers like I agree that the Guardian is doing more, but they're also still publishing articles in which they talk about droughts or food shortages in which there is no mention of the climate crisis, right? Up until yesterday, that is still happening. And fundamentally, these huge institutions are still backed by financial money. And what I might mean by that is they're still very much in the financial system. They are still invested essentially in the system being as it is. So there are going to be hard limits to what it is that they are able to reform in order to guarantee their own survival, right? So for anyone that is brave enough to go and work in a diseased environment and try to do it, I applaud you, and I do think that it is necessary. I also think it's necessary that there are people like me who think that that's not possible and are trying to create some other thing with which we can then begin to invite people.
Very good question.
Hi, Rachel.
Hi.
Mentioned about the fact that journalism's had to, well, as a journalist, you've had to grapple with this idea of objectivity and neutrality in advocacy. I think a lot of scientists are also feeling that position too, and that tension. Is there something that scientists can learn, I think, from the journey that journalists like yourself have been on in terms of their role and the neutrality or not of their position?
Oh, what a good question. Probably. Yeah. I think we all have something to learn from everyone. I think that whilst journalism is afraid of losing its reputation, science is afraid of losing its funding, which is a bigger existential threat, right? And so what can scientists learn? It's not on you to tell me what scientists could learn, actually. You're the scientist. I just think, yes, like absolutely. I think that there's a huge amount of power in recognizing one's own biases, morality, values, and all of these kinds of things, and how you then approach a problem. And also the other thing I think is that it is how we begin to treat one another as adults as well. Like, it is so infantilizing to have to be given objective information because I am seemingly incapable of establishing how this person's biases might impact the way that they're reporting. And so we pretend that they're not reporting in any kind of biased way. Tell me who you are, and then I will be able to establish how it is that I receive this information. And I think for scientists, that is so important as well right now, because no matter your area of interest or research or whatever, at the end of the day, we are all people within a community. We're all organisms within an ecosystem. And if we start approaching from that value at the beginning and being honest with one another about what it is that we wish to achieve, I think that we will be able to do more. And I think also then we will kind of be able to like pull our heads out of the jaws of this existential threat. And I think personally, much like there has been this explosion of interest in independent, advocacy journalism, I have no doubt that there's money in the world for, independent advocacy science.
Well, there's a question.
Hi, I'm a massive fan of your show and supporter. So happy here. I was wondering how can we help you? How can the scientific community, or maybe like there's also quite a lot of data people, including myself here, how could we contribute or help climate journalists do better work, more work?
Those scientific papers that you guys write. If you would all be willing to, you do the abstract. I think if scientists learned how to write one-pager press releases, that could genuinely be really, really helpful. And maybe that's something that us journalists that then need to collaborate with you on, like learning when you reach a certain scientific result, or when the data reads one way, what is the story in the data? I think that's sort of a part of the problem. There's so much data to go through. And so how is it that you were communicating with us in a way that sort of streamlines the process? Off the top of my head, that's the only thing that I can really think of. Do you have any ideas?
No, I think there should be more interaction. Like, I guess I hear you on the show saying often when it's about numbers, you say like, oh, I'm not that into the numbers, right? So,
Yeah.
but like maybe it's just you need more data people coming to you and like helping you out, or saying like pointing out like this is something interesting in data, or indeed like I guess science communication in general, like it is what you're saying. Can we make it clearer to the general public what that science actually means? But yeah, like I think maybe reaching out to you if you open for it, or like just a platform way to like propose like data stories.
Yeah,
Good.
definitely.
Okay, I guess we're directly on that.
Just jump in and add something, because I feel like there's quite an extreme difference in talking and thinking and kind of the fields of knowledge from data science to journalism. And if you look around in a normal way of organizing this, there would be a press officer, there would be a visual editor, there's a bunch of people being involved in this. And I remember for our second event, we were gonna have the press officer of Greenpeace, and she having the understanding of how activism works and how Greenpeace's campaigns work, but also having background as a journalist, she could understand how those two worlds can actually come together, and when is the right time and in what way to give a story to a journalist. What is the news cycle? Where are you in your process, so that when I come, you don't feel like, what are you barging into my space? I'm in the middle of something. No, you would let it up, right? It's how are things swaying? Being able to see that there are waves. You need somebody who can see that there are waves, so you know when is the right time to go Rachel and say, hey Rachel, I think you're gonna need a story soon.
But then maybe we need the journalists to like lay out what their promise is, or what their cycle is, or when they're open to something new. Like, so they're also inviting us like to come to them, because we don't know about that cycle, right?
No.
So it's teaching us about how you work and how journalism works.
Can I say one thing? So I get a lot of emails from PR companies that all immediately go in my trash filter. But one thing that drives me mad is that I am freelance, right, in what I do. So if you contact me with a story, but it is going out to other people, I'm not going to touch it. You've just wasted my time. So that's something that I would say. If you want to place a story with a journalist that you like, give it exclusively to them and they will immediately pay it. Like if you say to somebody, I've got an exclusive for you, they will immediately pay attention to what it is that you have to say. And if it's not for them, they will likely, if they're a decent person, hand you on to somebody or give you names for who it is. But I think that has to be really, like, send out a press release if you want, or something in the format of a press release, but do it exclusively. Build your independent relationships with certain journalists and build trust between them. Because otherwise it's just a waste of everybody's time.
Very good. There's a question here.
Yeah, hi Rachel. I really very much like your work as well. Last week I spoke with somebody, Philippe Joubert. I don't know if you have heard of him. He might be interesting for your show. He's co-founder of Earth on Board. He's involved with Planet Earth also. So he has a business background, but he seems to be like into activism at his whole day. And he's saying, if you want systems change, you have to take care of the losers. How do you relate to that? It's very different from the general sentiment here, but it's an interesting perspective also.
Yeah, in narrative change, we talk about the fact that you need to give people a golden gate of retreat. And this is something that I have found increasingly in my work. And my work has made me a much less black and white, morally focused person. Most people are just trying to survive, and then a lucky few are trying to have a good time, right? That's it. And most people are doing what they think is best with regards to whatever intention it is that they have, either surviving or having a good time. There are very, very few evil people in the world. There are few bad people in the world. And it is dangerous to focus on climate or inequality or whatever as it's a justice problem, but it's not a morality problem, right? You will lose people in the weeds immediately. So when I hear that, like, how do we take care of the losers? I think of these people, the people that are set to lose with systems change or overhaul. How is it that we invite them in? Because if we don't find a way to invite them in, they are going to hold on for as long as possible, and things might be totally catastrophically destroyed by that point. I speak to loads of people. I speak to like loads of bloody people. I was at a conference with private jet industry recently, because I was like, that sounds fun. Yeah, let's go and see what these people have to say. And they all know what's coming. These really, really rich people, they all know what's coming, and none of them feel like they can do anything about it. None of them feel like they are empowered. I speak with them And it's the same conversation I have with people on the street. It's the same conversation I have with people at universities, on campuses. It's the same conversation I have with everybody, except in a 5-star hotel and they're swigging really luxury champagne. It is this, people everywhere, all over the world, have the same feeling that they are losing some sense of power or control over their life. And so they are holding on to whatever it is that they can. And I think that we need to recognize that if we are to build bridges. This is a collaborative problem. We don't have time for these binaries. We don't have time for these kind of like moral debates or ideological differences. We are running out of time. Get who you can on side by figuring out how to speak to them. Do not be so wedded to your own vision or ideology or belief set that you can only speak to people in the language that you understand. What matters are the results. And it matters how we get there. So if we can find a way to do that collaboratively, then we are in chance. We have a chance of coming out of the other side in 2050 with having mitigated some of the disaster that's on the horizon.